There we go. All right. There's that woman again, recording in progress. Good evening. This is the last class of the semester. So what we'll do tonight is review. And then for those of you who are taking the class for credit, and any of you auditors who want it, I will send you the the final exam. And you have a week. It will be just like the midterm. It is open notes, open book, short answer questions. A lot of the questions you can answer with just a word or two. The worst question in the bunch, you probably wouldn't have to write more than a paragraph, more than 4 lines, and probably not even that much. 130 questions, just like the midterm exam, and you have 1 week from the time I send it to get it back to me. You can email it, scan it, mail it, however you want to return it. Okay. So I will tell you that the final exam covers both 1st and 2nd Samuel. So there will be questions in there that are reminiscent of the midterm because it is a comprehensive final, or relatively speaking. So what we're going to do tonight is kind of go back to the beginning and just sort of survey all the way through. I will start with some introductory things about the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Then we'll go to 2nd Samuel and survey our way through that. That's where the bulk of the final comes from. And time permitting, then we'll come back and look at a few things from the final, from the overall scope of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So, time-wise, 1st and 2nd Samuel, one book originally in the Hebrew, divided into two in the days of the Septuagint translators because of the way they recorded the books, divided into 2 parts. Covers 3 lives, basically. Covers the life of Samuel, the life of Saul, the first king of Israel, and the life of David. Now, David rules and reigns for 40 years. Saul before him rules and reigns for 40 years. That's 80 years. Samuel judges Israel and serves as a prophet for many, many years. But before the reign of Saul, Samuel serves for probably in the neighborhood of 25 to 30 years. Now, if David's reign begins at roughly 1000 or 1010 BC, just a shade over 1,000 years before the Christ, that puts us back to almost 1100 BC for the time of Samuel's beginning to serve as priest and prophet and judge. And that puts us back a little before 1100 BC for the time of his birth. So, Samuel is prophet, priest, and judge. And the significance of that is that Samuel is the last of the judges who effectively ruled Israel. Now, you remember at the end of the book of Judges, the very last verse, the statement that's repeated twice in chapter 17, verse 6, and again at the very last verse, 21 and verse 25, the statement is made, in those days, there was no king in Israel. And each man did what was right in his own eyes. That roughly 350 or 400 years from about 1075 or 1085 backwards for about 350, 400 years. So back to roughly 1400 or thereabouts BC. That was one of the bleakest, most turbulent, violent, ungodly periods in Israel's history. You would think coming out of Egypt, being delivered by the power of God, being fed, being guided, being corrected, being taken care of, and then going in and possessing the land under General Joshua and receiving the blessings that God had been promised, you would think that these people would have been paragons of virtue. And in fact, they were anything but. So we come down to the time of Samuel, and as the last of the judges, Samuel is the bridge between the brutality, the violence, the corruption of the time of the judges, the civil war that is at the end of the book of Judges. Samuel is the bridge between that dark ages of Israel, basically, and the time of Israel's greatness under David. He shepherds the people through that time. He is the strong public leader in the nation, even though he just rides a circuit from place to place to judge the people. He doesn't cover the whole country, and he's not the ruler, but he is the public leader of the nation. In spite of that, each head of family. Now you have 12 tribes in Israel, 12 territories, plus the Levites. In each clan or each tribe, you have various families, and each patriarch or each head of family was supposed to be the one who ensured that God's laws were honored, that God's will was accomplished, that the people were educated and knowledgeable and faithful. And it becomes very clear very quickly that a whole lot of them fell down on the job and didn't do that. Now, all through the time of the judges, Israel is being tested and seems to fail again and again and again and again. God raises up judges to deliver them. And when Samuel comes along, Samuel, of course, is the object of prayer, of request from God. That's what his name means. I asked of the Lord, and the Lord gave to me. The time of Samuel marks, as I said, the change from decentralized leadership in the nation as a whole to a strong centralized leadership under a king. You go to 1 Samuel chapter 8, and we read there about the elders of the tribes coming to Samuel, and they say, give us a king, appoint for us, anoint for us, choose for us a king. Now, why would they come to Samuel? Samuel is the de facto spiritual leader. He's the priest, the high priest at that point. He is the prophet of God. He is the spiritual authority in a sense, or represents spiritual authority. They've never had a king. They recognize, the elders recognize, we have a problem. We've come through a civil war to get to this point. We've had hundreds of years of all kinds of vice and corruption, misbehavior and misuse and abuse. We got to do something about this. Samuel, you're getting older. Your sons are alarmingly like Eli's sons. They're not upright men. We think the solution is a king. But what's the basis of their thought? 1 Samuel 8, give us a king. Why? So we can be like the nations around us. Ever since they came out of Egypt, roughly 400 years, through the wilderness wanderings, while they were in Egypt 430 years, then after Moses, through the wilderness wanderings, encountering other peoples that they'd never met before, into the promised land, conquering the promised land, overcoming the Ammonites and the Moabites and the various other ites and the Philistines and so forth. What have they seen in every one of these foreign nations? They've seen a centralized government. They've seen a king, a ruler, a strong man. And to their way of thinking, it looks like to them that works well. Give us a king so we can be just like them. Never mind that some of those kings, like Pharaoh, demand to be worshiped as if they're gods. Never mind that some of those kings pick whichever false god or idol seems to suit their personalities, or seems to whose priests and soothsayers say what the king wants to hear as the official. They choose him as the official deity. Give us a king so we can be like them. We look at the the journey of the Israelites through these years, they are playing catch up in a lot of ways, and not good ways. Technologically, they're playing catch up as a Bronze Age people in an Iron Age world. The Philistines, notably, fought with iron weapons and had iron tools, and the Israelites, by and large, did not at first. But in a host of other ways, they're playing catch up with their neighbors, in that their neighbors have a history of ungodliness, and the Israelites seem to just plunge headfirst into that to try to out ungodly some of their neighbors. So all of 1 Samuel, the 31 chapters of 1 Samuel, record for us both Samuel's birth and rise to leadership, and the establishment of Saul, the change in government and the establishment of Saul as the first king. The interesting thing is, you go back to Genesis 49 and verse 10, as Jacob is parceling out, so to speak, blessings, prophesying blessings for his various sons, he comes to Judah and says, the scepters, the ruler's staff, the scepter shall not depart from between his feet until Shiloh comes. And then we come over here to 1 Samuel, and lo and behold, the first king of Israel is not from the tribe of Judah. He's a Benjaminite. But there's a logical explanation. Saul is God's response to the people's demand. Saul is selected, in a manner of speaking, for them to understand, think of him as a living illustration of every warning that Samuel gave them about what the king would do, because he ticks every box. He becomes arrogant, he becomes self-centered, he becomes drunken with power, he abuses his own people, he drafts their sons and their daughters and so forth, and he becomes the living embodiment of every bad thing that Samuel warns them about. So when then David comes along, David becomes the fulfillment of that prophecy, the beginning of that prophecy that Jacob had given about the tribe of Judah. Well, Saul and David, the first and the greatest kings, are brought into view in 1 Samuel. Going over to 2 Samuel, which is where we'll spend the first part of our class now in review. 2 Samuel picks up after the death of Saul. So the events of 1 Samuel cover the life of Samuel, the time of Samuel's life, plus the reign of Saul. So we have a time span here of probably in the neighborhood of 100 years from the beginning of 1 Samuel to chapter 31. You've got 40 years of Saul's reign, and you've got all of a big part of Samuel's life as well. All of Samuel's life, really. So it covers approaching 100 years of history. 2 Samuel covers roughly 40 years. It covers the reign of David. And from the time that he is acclaimed king over Judah, not over the whole nation, but over Judah at Hebron, to the time that he is ready to die and hand off the kingdom to Solomon, is 40 years. 7.5 years in Judah, and then 33 years, or 7.5 in Judah, and 33 years more, total of a little over 40 years in Jerusalem. David is the main character throughout 2 Samuel. The focus is on him almost exclusively. And you see in David, even a good man, a godly man, has his shortcomings in this position of basically absolute power, or almost absolute power. I forget which of the English statesmen from a couple of hundred years ago made the observation that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But you see that in Saul, and to somewhat of a lesser extent, you see that in David as well. Time and again in David's life, we see him, and this is the man described as a man after God's own heart, the guy who always comes back to God. But time and again, what do we see? David walking by sight. David walking in the wisdom of his own thoughts rather than in the wisdom of the Lord. Now, when he becomes king in Judah, only in Judah, it's because the nation is divided. Saul, in his erratic leadership, has divided the nation. Under Saul, David has become a mighty warrior. He's gone from being a shepherd to being a warrior and a leader of men, and well recognized, well known among all the tribes. But their frame of reference for rulership is the son of the king becomes the next king. Saul and 3 of his sons die in battle with the Philistines, but not all of his sons are dead. And so Abner, his cousin, elevates Ishbosheth eventually. But Ishbosheth rules in Saul's stead, not for the whole 7.5 years of David's rulership in Judah, but actually for about 2 years or maybe a little more. So apparently there is a power vacuum in much of Israel from the time that David becomes king in Hebron until the day that Ishbosheth becomes king in Gilead over the other tribes. And Ishbosheth is a weakling king all along. He is not actually in charge. Abner, his uncle, is pulling the strings. And of course, that ultimately leads to Abner throwing his lot in with David and turning against Ishbosheth. But the nation was divided during this time. Saul had his followers, and you think about some of the things that Saul had said and done when he's hunting for David. When David is on the run in the latter chapters of 1 Samuel, what is Saul telling his servants, his soldiers, his followers? I'm the one who's made you wealthy. I'm the one who's given you this property or that property. I'm the one who's taken care of you. You owe me. Well, even after he's dead, there is an understandable degree of loyalty there, although Saul had not been an upright man in many ways. But those who served him were not necessarily upright men either. Think about Abner. Abner had been Saul's general, but Abner has an agenda of his own and had long before Saul died and continued to long after Saul's death. These guys had grown very comfortable maneuvering against each other, maneuvering for power. So during that period between David becoming king in Judah and David becoming king of all Israel, you have several years there of basically power vacuum where there's no leadership and the nation is not cohesive. Now, before David becomes king, word comes to him at the beginning of 2 Samuel of the death of Saul, that Saul and his sons have died in battle against the Philistines. And David is the logical person in many ways to carry that word to, because many of the people of Israel do see him as the natural choice to be the next leader. Go back to 1 Samuel, and after David has become a military leader under Saul's government and proven himself in battle, what's the song that the women sing of David's exploits compared to Saul's? Saul has slain his thousands, but
thousands, and David his 10,000s.
Tens of thousands. And of course, that was the catalyst for Saul to kind of bow up and begin to be suspicious of David. Well, what more could he want but the crown? And Saul is not thinking spiritually at all. He's thinking very politically, and his focus is on maintaining control and power. Well, David comes out and goes in, as it were. David is all over the countryside in authority from Saul, and everything he does, he proves himself a wise and conscientious leader. None of Saul's sons who survived. Now, Jonathan might have proven to be a comparable leader, but Jonathan's loyalty was to David. What does Jonathan know about David? Jonathan knows that David has been anointed to be the next king. Jonathan knows that he's not going to be the next king, and he's good with that. But Jonathan died, along with two of his brothers and his father. Jonathan died fighting for Israel. Ishbosheth, the remaining son, he's not like Jonathan. And so, with Abner's encouragement, he's not willing to accept that his father has been displaced as king and that David is chosen by God. Now, he might seem to be the legitimate heir to the throne, and that's the choice that the men of Benjamin are trying to, and Abner particularly, that's the choice that they're trying to be the driving force behind. You think about 12 tribes plus the Levites, and the first king, the greatest king Israel has ever had up to this point, is from what tribe? The first king, the greatest king so far,
Benjamin,
is from the tribe of Benjamin. Think about Benjamin as a tribe and think about their past history. It's not real flattering, is it? This is the tribe where the Levite had been, whose concubine was raped and abused all night, some of whose men had actually wanted the Levite and the old man. And this was the tribe whose refusal to hand over those ungodly men for justice had precipitated a civil war in the days leading up to the time of Samuel. This was the tribe that had been the source of a number of frustrating, irritating, embarrassing events in Israel's history. This was the smallest tribe in Israel by a rather wide margin. But this was also the fightiest tribe in Israel in some ways. We know that the men of Benjamin were renowned for their fierceness, their violence in battle, even though there weren't a lot of them. For them to have the king then, to be the tribe of the king, that's something that the tribe wants to hold on to. And the movers and shakers, men like Abner, are really pushing to try to achieve that. They have an outsized influence in the nation. And during Saul's rule, they have had an outsized benefit. Saul had worked things to benefit his kinfolks to a large degree. So, Ishbosheth would seem like the logical choice. And the men of Benjamin certainly want to keep it that seeming that way. But David has already been chosen. And one of the things that is noteworthy is that it was known, maybe not known to everyone in Israel, but it was known to plenty of people in Israel that Samuel had anointed David. So God's choice is already known. You get into 2 Samuel then, and in chapters 2 and 3 and 4, you have the chaos and the confusion that comes in the aftermath of Saul's death. The nation is without a king for the first time in 40 years. And so David has been told years before, David has prophesied as a result of being anointed years before, He's had that experience. The Spirit of the Lord has been with him. He's conversation. He's had intercourse in the sense of being guided and taught and principled by Samuel and by Nathan and by Gad, and will continue to be by Nathan and Gad to a large degree, prophets of God. He's had good training. So now what does he do? Well, Saul is dead. Lord, what do I do? Shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah? Chapter 2. And the Lord sends him. Yes, you go to Hebron. That's where he becomes king over the tribe of Judah. David is of the tribe of Judah. The prophecy of Jacob begins to be fulfilled here. And now he is on the path to ruling the whole nation. In chapter 3, you see at the end of chapter 2, you've got civil war, basically. Now, how extensive is the war between David's followers and Ishbosheth's followers? We really don't know, other than there was conflict. At one point, 20,000 dead. But the main focus in chapter 2, the latter part of chapter 2, is the tension, you might say, between the sons of Zeruiah, Abishai and Asahel and Hushai, or Joab rather, not Hushai, and Abner. And in the course of this, of course, Abner is going to end up killing Asahel, and Abishai is not going to forgive and forget. It's going to take a long time, but Abishai wants justice, or in reality, what he wants is vengeance. Remember that Abner's killing of Asahel is not murder. They are in conflict. Now, we can debate all night if they should have been fighting each other. Realistically, they should not have been. They're fellow Hebrews. But they were on opposing sides, and so this was de facto war. And Abner did try to dissuade Asahel from pursuing him. Asahel was fixed on him, going to take him out. And so he defended himself. Well, what he did was brutal and undoubtedly excruciatingly painful for Asahel. But Abishai takes it as murder, which it was not. Asahel brought it on himself. Nevertheless, during this time, we see Abner reaching for more power. One of the things that he does is that he appropriates for himself one of Saul's concubines. In that time, the right of taking the former king's concubines belonged to the new king alone. We'll see that David eventually takes into his collection some of Saul's concubines himself. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, does not appear to have done this, but he recognized that Abner was effectively staking a claim to his own throne by doing this. And when he approached Abner about it, reproached him, Abner's response basically was, I made you king and I'll take you out. I'll just hand everything over to David if that's how you're going to be. And that's exactly what he does. In chapter 3, Abner throws his weight behind David. Now, what has happened over the period of this couple of years that Ishbosheth has been king and the forces have been in conflict with each other, what has happened is that David's had success and Ishbosheth has not. And Abner wants to be on the winning side. He's not stupid. He's a good tactician. So he chooses to change sides. One thing that stands out, though, is that before David will even speak to Abner face to face, he lays down a condition. What's the condition that he lays down to even talk to Abner? You look into chapter 3, I require this. I require my wife back. Now that's Michal David's first wife, Saul's younger daughter, the girl who had been madly in love with him early on and whom he had loved originally. But Saul, when David had to flee, had by fiat basically not dissolved their marriage, but simply taken her and handed her off to somebody else that had more favor with him, a fellow by the name of Paltiel, and she'd been his wife. It was not legitimate, but that's Saul exercising his prerogative as king to do as he pleases. And she apparently has lived with Paltiel all these years. David says, I'll not entertain your proposal unless and until you restore my wife. And it takes about that long for Abner to fetch her and put Paltiel out of the picture and hand her back to David. Well, later on, we're going to see her attitude toward David is not good. In the matter of bringing the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem, when they finally get it right and get it there, she mocks David, despises him, and he does not live with her as husband with wife ever after that. She's been defiled. But he isolates her at that point. Think about her perspective on this. She's Saul's child. From somewhere about the time that she was of marriageable age, probably mid to late teen years when she marries David, Saul has not been a godly man. So in her formative years are governed by her father drifting away from God and then basically actively turning against God. She does not have a good foundation of solid teaching in the way of the Lord as David did, evidently. But then think about her experience in life. Why was she married to David in the first place? Well, she loved him and he loved her, but that wasn't why they got married. Saul agreed to their marriage for one reason: to use her as a lever, as a wedge on David, to spy on David, to ensnare David, to keep a check on him. So she's being used by her own father. Then when David falls out of favor with Saul to the point that he has to run for his life, even though she helps David escape, what does her father then do with her? Well, he hands her off to some other guy that's currently in favor with him. And here she is stuck with Paltiel. Whether she liked him, hated him, or was indifferent to him, we don't know. He evidently loved her, because when she's restored to David, he comes along weeping and is then dismissed. But she's been a pawn in her father's hands. Now she's a pawn in Abner's hands. And ultimately, she's going to feel, in a sense, like a pawn in David's hands because of her own behavior, her own words and actions. So, on one level, we look at her and we're pretty harsh with her, and maybe justifiably so. But on the other hand, she had a pretty raw deal in some ways. So her feelings might be somewhat understandable. Come down to chapter 5, and now David becomes king over all Israel. Ishbosheth is displaced. Now, Ishbosheth is ultimately murdered by some of his own people. And, it's not a good idea to be the guy that kills the king, or claims to kill the king, or claims to kill someone, even like Ishbosheth, who was not the legitimate king, but was related in some way. The man that brought the Amalekite that brought David news of Saul's death tried to claim credit and wound up being executed. He lied. The guys that bring David news of Ishbosheth's death wind up the same way for having murdered royalty, basically. But in chapter 5, David now becomes king over all Israel. The other tribes finally accept him, and he removes from Hebron to Jerusalem and becomes the king in Jerusalem. That sets up chapter 6 for the bringing of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, we know that during Saul's reign, the Ark of the Covenant, or during the time of the judges, the Ark of the Covenant had been sent out into battle and captured and had its adventures. All these years, it's been away from Jerusalem. In chapter 6, they proposed to bring it to Jerusalem. Presumably, everything else associated with the tabernacle is there. And of course, we have the interlude with Uzzah. They did not inquire, they did not check to see how to do it properly. They tried to move it just like the Philistines had, basically, and it backfired. Uzzah died, and the tabernacle spends 3 months in the house of Obed-Edom. They just stopped in their tracks and put it over there and watched to see what would happen. Well, the Lord blessed Obed-Edom. And then they, in the meantime, go back and read the directions. Interesting thing here, something to think about. What was one of the requirements that Samuel had laid down for the kings of Israel? One of the things they were supposed to do, that they had responsibility to do when they became king.
They were supposed to write the law themselves by their own hand, but I think Moses gave that decree, not Samuel.
Okay, Moses originated it. Samuel then undoubtedly reminded them of it. But did David ever do that? I don't know. If he
Doesn't appear to, he doesn't appear to have.
Yeah, if he did, he must not have paid attention, or he'd have known how to move the ark properly. But after the incident with Uzzah, he did go back, he or the priests or someone delegated by him, and search and learn, here's where we messed up. We didn't do this properly. Bringing the ark into Jerusalem then is accompanied by great celebration, and this is the incident where Michal mocks David for his exuberance, and that tears things between them. She lives as a living widow from that point on. He wants nothing more to do with her. And that brings us then over to chapter 7. And in chapter 7, we look at this usually, and the part we focus on is, David and Nathan are talking, and David says, Nathan, it's not right that I live in a fancy palace and the temple, the Lord's house is a tent. I want to build a temple. And Nathan says, yeah, do that. And then God says, no, don't do that. And Nathan has to go back and tell him, you can't do that after all. That's usually what we focus on. We miss that chapter 7 is where God makes a covenant with David and tells him, all right, here's what I'm going to, you want to do this for me? Here's what I'm going to do for you instead. You want to build me a house? I'll build you a house. But it's not a physical house at all. God will not allow him to build the temple. And we focus sometimes on 1 Chronicles chapter 23, or chapter 28 and verse 3 as being the reason that is because David was a warrior, a man of blood. But even though his motive surely was an honorable one, he wanted to do something to honor God. The key point that God makes is, I didn't tell you to do that. I didn't ask you to do that. Show me where anybody, where I've ever asked anybody to do that. It's not there. So David is not allowed to carry out the plan, although he prepares everything for Solomon later on to do that. And in the meantime, you look down to chapter 7, verses 12 and 13, and here, when your days are fulfilled, and you shall lie down, or you shall sleep with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body and establish his kingdom. And he'll build a house for my name. And if we just stopped right there, we'd say, oh, that's Solomon. Well, that's true. That's the literal fulfillment, the physical fulfillment. He'll build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. There's the metaphoric, or there's the prophetic aspect of it, because now we're not talking about Solomon. Now we're talking about Christ. The kingdom that lasts forever is not, as the millennialists insist, the national kingdom of Israel. The kingdom that lasts forever is the spiritual kingdom of Israel, which is what? That's the church, according to Galatians 6 and verse 15 or 16. The Israel of God. So David proposes to build God a house. And God responds by saying, I'll tell you what, I'll build you a house. And that's the balance of chapter 7. And David ends up in a magnificent prayer of gratitude in chapter 7. So you come to chapters 8, 9, and 10, and here is just a listing of David's conquests. David's consolidation of the kingdom really is what this is. He's welding the 12 tribes into one cohesive nation again. They haven't been this cohesive probably since the days of Joshua and the conquest. And in the meantime, what else is going on? They're conquering neighboring kingdoms. They're subduing Canaanites that are still living in the land. You've got pockets of resistance of people. You've got Amalekites that should have been dispossessed or slaughtered years and years ago under Saul, and they're still around, and they're still a problem. You've got Gibeonites that are still around, and of course, Joshua had made a treaty with them, which then Saul had violated, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But David is consolidating the kingdom and reducing the influence of the Canaanites on his people. Now, as we go through chapters 8, 9, and 10, one of the things David does is to seek out, for Jonathan's sake, for the sake of his covenant, his promise to Jonathan, seek out if there are any of Saul's descendants still living. And of course, Ziba, a former servant of Saul, says, well, Mephibosheth, Jonathan's crippled son, is over here. And Jonathan's crippled son, Mephibosheth, actually has a son of his own, Micah. And David then restores to Mephibosheth all of Saul's estates and so forth for the sake of his friendship with Jonathan, and elevates him to a position of honor. And Ziba is put in charge of all of this, given responsibility to act as Mephibosheth's steward. That's going to come back later on, because Ziba is not the upright man that he might appear to be, as we see later on in the days of Absalom. Well, go ahead. Somebody said something? Jeffrey, was that you?
No, I'm okay.
Oh, okay. No problem. Well, that brings us then, as David is consolidating the kingdom and setting the stage for greater things. Now we come to chapter 11. And here's where things start to go off the rails for David. We don't know why, but David does not go out with the army. At this point, he's probably in his 40s. So he's still got most of his rulership ahead of him, at least half of it. But his army, under Joab's leadership, is in the field fighting the Ammonites and laying siege to Rabbah, one of their capital cities. It may be that with them laying siege, there's not a lot for David to do in the battlefield, and he can go home. Whatever reason, he's not out with the army. Enter Bathsheba. There's nothing here that suggests that Bathsheba deliberately tried to catch his attention or seduce him or anything of that sort. He saw her, he wanted her, he took her without regard to the fact that she was a married woman, without regard to the fact that he already had a house full of wives and concubines of his own. He gave in to the lust of the moment. And the consequences never left him. He tries to conceal the sin of her conception, her pregnancy, in 3 ways. Summons Uriah, her husband, from the battlefront. Now, you get down to the end of 2 Samuel, and who is Uriah? Uriah is one of David's mighty men. He should be a trusted and honored and respected by David member of his, not his inner circle necessarily, but his trusted soldiers. Surely David knows what he's doing. Look at chapter 11, and you see here at verse 3, David sent and inquired about the woman. And one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Uriah is a stranger, a Hittite who has cast his lot with Israel, basically sworn loyalty to Israel, adopted, become a proselyte, adopted the Hebrew religion. He's one of David's trusted, valiant soldiers. David can't plead ignorance. Well, I didn't know she was his wife. He knew she was Uriah's wife before he ever defiled her. But now he's got to try to cover up what he's done. Did she resist? Did she cooperate? We don't know. It doesn't matter. He's got to try to cover it up. Bring Uriah back from the front. Take the evening off after you've reported. Go home, spend some time with your wife. And he won't do it. The rest of the army's out in the field. It's not appropriate for me to do that. Never mind that David was. Well, that didn't work. Plan number 2, we'll get him drunk and then he'll cooperate. And even drunk, Uriah doesn't go home. Plan number 3, we've got to get rid of him. So David sends him back to the front carrying his own death warrant and has him effectively murdered. David's actions here lead directly to the death of 2 of his sons, Amnon and Absalom, and probably are traceable to the rape of Tamar as well. Because in chapter 12 and verse 9, when Nathan comes and exposes David, God charges David with Uriah's murder, even though he had used others and in fact had used basically the sword of the Amalekites to actually kill him. David was responsible. You go forward from here And this is the tipping point in David's reign. From this point forward, everything about David's rulership is kind of on the downslope. Strife among his children. You come to chapter 13 now. Amnon, David's firstborn, his oldest child, rapes his half-sister Tamar, and then boots her out, shames her publicly, wants nothing more to do with her once he's had what he wanted. Absalom, her brother, plots revenge, waits 2 years, perhaps waiting to see if David would do anything about it, because David knows what has transpired and takes no action. Why would David do nothing? Why would you think David did nothing when he knew what Amnon had done? Any ideas?
Maybe it was because David felt his own guilt and didn't feel qualified, if you will, to point the finger at somebody else.
Okay. Number one, David's sin with Bathsheba was known. It may not have been known nationwide, but it was known in the palace. Somebody had gone and fetched her for him. Somebody had known that he'd been inquiring about her. It was known. Now that child had died. David had pleaded and begged, and the whole palace had seen him face down and refusing to eat. And then after that child's death, Solomon was born. Here's Solomon, a whole generation behind his brothers. But David, even if he was not guilty of rape with Bathsheba, and he may have been, but even if it was entirely consensual, it was known, at least within the palace. You know that his sons would have known something about it, or would have heard the whispers anyway. And it would be awkward for him to let this come out in public. Absalom waits 2 years, does not speak a word to Amnon, has nothing to do with him. Perhaps he's waiting to see if Daddy will do something about it. Give him the benefit of the doubt. But at 2 years, his patience is exhausted. And so now he's ready to take matters into his own hands. Now, under the law of Moses, a near kinsman had responsibility for vengeance in matters like this. And in one sense, Absalom qualifies. But in the intervening years since the giving of that law and the practice of the avenger of blood, what's happened? Israel now has a king to adjudicate these cases. And so Absalom doesn't have the authority that he'd have had hundreds of years before to take the matter into his own hands. Now there's someone to judge this. And the right way for him to handle it would have been to bring it to his father and challenge his father to render judgment, but he didn't do that. Filled with hatred, he engineers the murder of his own brother and then has to flee. In chapter 14 now, we have Absalom. Joab actually engineers Absalom's return to Jerusalem. This stratagem of the woman from Tekoa telling the tale and getting the king's sympathy and so forth. And of course, David's response to this is, "You tell me one thing, lady. Did Joab put you up to this?" Apparently, Joab had been talking about this. And so, fine, Joab, you go fetch Absalom, but I'm not going to see him. 2 years between the rape and the murder. 3 years of self-imposed exile. Had Absalom stayed, David really could not have avoided dealing with this publicly. So in a ironic roundabout way, Absalom kind of did him a favor, even though David's heart went out to him in his isolation. So he comes back 2 years in Jerusalem. He's not allowed to see David. Finally, a reconciliation is brought to pass. And what does Absalom begin to do? Now he's campaigning for king. Look down to chapter 15. Here, Absalom gets himself a chariot, horses, a group of men to accompany him and to run before him. He starts to act like a big shot, like a politician. And he goes to the gate and stands and renders judgment, even though it has no force. And whoever he talks to, you're right. You deserve justice. If there was just a judge to adjudicate this, I would give you justice. And of course, you get two guys in disagreement with each other. He's right. He's right. You're both right. Well, they can't both be right. Well, you're right too. You come down here and it says the net effect was that Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Question, why would David allow this? Surely he was aware of it. Why would David allow this? I would suggest that, again, this kind of gets back to David being, shall we say, acutely aware of his own failings as king. He's, in a sense, he's doing his best to indulge Absalom and try to keep things open between them. Absalom, in the meantime, Absalom is a little bit like the younger prodigal son over in the book of Luke. You remember in the parable of the prodigals, the younger son comes to the father and says, I want my share. Now, what normally has to take place before a son inherits?
Father has to die.
Yeah, the father has to die. So the youngster saying, go ahead and give me my share is tantamount to saying, would you just hurry up and die? Well, Absalom's actions are very similar. He might as well have been saying to David, would you hurry up and die so I can be king? Amnon had been the firstborn. He would have been the logical choice to be king. Absalom appears to be next in line or pretty close. And so he's maneuvering to lay claim to the throne. David's in the way. That's no object for Absalom. He's very willing to push his own father out of the way. He takes 4 years. So now it's been 2 years from the rape of Tamar to the death of Amnon, the murder of Amnon. 3 years in exile, that's 5 years. 2 years back in Jerusalem before he finally gets to ostensibly reconcile with his father, the king. And then he spends the next 4 years. So it's 11 years later that he is stealing the hearts of the men of Israel and campaigning to be king. And so now he's got his plans in place. I'm going to go offer sacrifice, pay my vow. I'm going to Hebron. What's significant about Hebron? Why would he go to Hebron? Historically, belongs to Caleb. It's part of Judah. It's not that far from Jerusalem. It's where David had been crowned king. Absalom has a base there, a base of support there. But he's also been building a coalition throughout the nation. So he sends out his messengers. When you hear that I've been crowned, then you come to me, you rally to me. So that's what he does. He gets his people to acclaim him the new king and marches on Jerusalem. David is the mightiest warrior king that Israel ever has. David has had a tremendous army at his disposal at various times. David does not keep a standing army in and around Jerusalem. He has no reason to, and that costs a lot of money. When Absalom marches on Jerusalem, David, for all intents and purposes, is defenseless. He's got some of his mighty men and his trusted advisors and a few others around him, but they're no match for an organized army. He has no choice but to vacate the premises. So David flees from Jerusalem. It's during this time that Shimei, the son of Bichri, a man of Benjamin, comes out cursing and throwing stones and kicking dust at him and so forth, demonstrating his loyalty to Saul, blaming David for all the ills that have befallen Israel and so forth. And of course, Abishai is ready to just go put that rabid dog down, and David won't let him. David is clearly feeling guilt at this point. If this is the Lord's doing, so be it. Let him curse. And in the meantime, Absalom is trying to consolidate his power. Well, Joab, in chapter 14, had brokered the agreement between David and Absalom. Joab is going to come back into the picture here in a little bit. But as we go along, chapter 16, David is escaping. He sends back Hushai to be his spy and to communicate through the priests, Zadok and his sons. And at chapter 17, Hushai manages to negate the influence of one of David's former trusted counselors, Ahithophel. Now, it says a lot about Ahithophel that we read in chapter 17, when he was David's counselor, his word was considered as if God had spoken from heaven, basically. As if David had inquired of the Lord with the Urim and the Thummim. But it tells us more about Ahithophel than might meet the eye. That this man has thrown in with Absalom, the rebel. If he's such a good counselor, if he was such a wise advisor to David, why would he throw his lot in with Absalom? There's no explanation stated, but you think about his position. As counselor to the king, he has influence, he has power, he has pull. And if Absalom has spent 4 years campaigning and gaining popularity, Ahithophel is probably not immune to seeing which way the wind is blowing. And it looks like it's blowing for Absalom. Well, I can be on the winning side or I can be on the losing side, but when one king is deplaced by a would-be king, there's no in between. You're for me or you're against me. So he chooses Absalom's side, and David, through the influence of Hushai, manages to cut off his influence at the knees. And Ahithophel goes out and commits suicide. Well, that sets the stage then for the events of chapter 18. Civil war in Israel again. In our national history, we have one civil war, and it was bloody and horrible and prompted as many casualties as every other war we've been involved in combined, and then some. And the legacy of that civil war is with us 150 years later. Israel has had, this is now the third or fourth civil war in the last several hundred years. You already have tribal rivalries among the tribes. Just look at how the Benjaminites wanted to hang on to the throne through the descendants of Saul, and how loyal they were to the house of Saul, even though Saul was an ungodly man. Now we have civil war again. And as they prepare to go to battle, David gives a very specific command. Battle can't be avoided. David is disheartened. He's not at all sure that this is not God's judgment against him, because Nathan has said, this is what's going to happen. You're going to have trouble from now on. And boy, he has. But now at verse 5, chapter 18, David gives very specific public commandments to Joab and to Abishai and to Ittai the Philistine, the Gittite. You deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. In other words, I want him taken alive. I don't want him abused or misused or beaten or anything like that. I want him spared. The battle that ensues costs 20,000 Israelite casualties. And in the course of this, Absalom, his forces are being defeated. Absalom flees. Now he's riding a mule, catches his head, tradition says by his hair, in an oak tree. And when it's learned where he's stuck, got to be uncomfortable, Joab murders him. He uses some of his men, but it's Joab who's responsible. With Absalom dead, the war is over. His body is disposed of, basically, a poor burial, not at all befitting a prince of Israel. You look at chapter 18, verse 17. It might help if I was looking at 18 instead of 19. At verse 17, they took his body and threw it in a pit in the forest and just covered it with stones. That's not anything like a royal burial. And David is informed of his death and goes into mourning. With Absalom dead, the battle is over. David is weeping and mourning. And the people of Israel just disperse. Joab, in the meantime, learns how David has reacted and takes him to task. This is a great victory, and your behavior tells the people of Israel that you would just as soon all of your faithful soldiers had died as to have this rebel die. And David has to pick himself up and go console his own army. But he wants to know before he'll go back to Jerusalem, do you actually want me as king? Many of his own people had followed his rebellious son. And he wants confirmation, since God had said trouble's going to follow you from now on. He wants confirmation that they will accept him back as king. And they do. through the balance of chapter 19, Shimei comes out and repents of his ill behavior, and David pardons him. At the end of chapter 19, we have Mephibosheth, who has not groomed himself or washed himself or anything the whole time, however long this has been. He's been in mourning. Mephibosheth now comes to David, and turns out Ziba lied on him. Well, the division of the inheritance that belongs to Mephibosheth, half to Ziba, half to Mephibosheth, that's not really very fair. But you look at Mephibosheth's response, he says, let the servant have it all as long as I can have my king restored. It says a lot about his character as the son of Jonathan. Chapter 20 brings us to the rebellion of another Benjaminite, Sheba, the son of Bichri. And we don't know much about this man, but apparently he must have had a reputation. You look at the conversation between David and Amasa about him. Amasa has now become the de facto general of the army in Joab's space. Joab is going to murder him in just a minute. And the discussion here about Sheba, started to say Shimei, and I knew that wasn't right. And for a minute there, I couldn't get the right name. The discussion about Sheba is, look, this is going to be worse than Absalom's rebellion if we don't get right on top of this, which tells us in the aftermath of Absalom's rebellion and death, there must have still been a lot of discontent and dissension among the children of Israel. Sheba raises his standard, as it were, and says, we're not going to follow David. And he's able to gain a following. He holds up at Abel, and were it not for the wise counsel of an old woman, they'd have had to lay siege to the city, and a lot of innocent people would have been casualties of war. In the course of this, Joab seizes control of the army again by murdering Amasa. And it's Joab who ultimately is present at the execution of Sheba. The city of Abel is a loyal city. And when the demand is given, we'll let bygones be bygones and let's just all go home, just hand over Sheba's head. Well, the people of Abel, they'd a whole lot rather sacrifice him than have their city demolished. And that's what happens. Come into chapter 21, and we have the issue of the Gibeonites. Remember that Joshua had made a pact with them. It was ill-advised in Joshua chapter 9, but it was honored nonetheless. And he had even led the army of Israel out to deliver them from their own countrymen, their own people, who set up to destroy them for having made a pact with Israel. They were put to service as cutters of wood and bearers of water because of their deceptiveness. But Saul, and they were in the region of Saul's territory, Saul had simply taken it upon himself to violate that covenant and try to wipe them out. He didn't get all of them because obviously there are some Gibeonites here. And Israel suffers a famine now that David has consolidated the kingdom and he's passed through the rebellions, and frankly, things have settled down a little bit. Now it's time to set something right that has been wrong ever since the days of Saul, and that was the murder of a bunch of Gibeonites. And it turns out that it's the famine that Israel is suffering is because of Saul's sin. Good illustration here of the fact that the consequences of sin are never, ever, ever limited only to the sinner. The claim, well, don't talk to me about this because I'm not hurting anybody but myself, is a false claim. It's a lie. The consequences of sin are always larger than just the sinner, even if it's only because it offends God. But in this world, the consequences invariably extend beyond the sinner. This is Saul's doing, even though he's been dead lo these many years. Well, how do we fix this? The Gibeonites, they don't want money. They don't want the right to slay people, to murder people indiscriminately. They want the descendants of Saul, 7 of them, perfect number. And they will crucify their bodies. They'll hang their bodies up as a testimony before the Lord. Were these sons already dead? Maybe, maybe not. Regardless, David does spare Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. And then we have those 7 sons that are handed off. Notice that in some of the older texts at verse 19 in 1 Samuel chapter, going back to 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 19, the daughter of Saul here is Merab, not Michael, as some translations have it. Rizpah, the mother of 2 of these sons, protects their bodies until the Lord is satisfied and the famine breaks, rain comes. And David then, when all of this is said and done and all the dust settles, their bodies are taken and given a proper burial in the same tomb as Saul and Jonathan, Kish's tomb. The rest of chapter 21 tells us about more conflict with the Philistines. We have the mention of 4 of Goliath's kinfolks, Ishbi-Benob, who was about half the man that Goliath was. He was a giant, a large man, but his spear was about half size of Goliath's, so he wasn't quite that powerful. But he very nearly managed to kill David. Had it not been for the help of Abishai, David would have been murdered or killed in battle. You have 3 other giants slain, including a brother of Goliath. And the last one, mentioned in verses 20 and 21, is notable for having 6 fingers and 6 toes. And we talked a little bit about that being a peculiarity of the genes. Now, in chapters 22 and 23, you have a psalm by David, psalm of deliverance, and his last words in chapter 23. And there are a couple of things that stand out, particularly in chapter 23, the description of inspiration that comes in verse 2. And then notice over here in chapter 23, in verses 9 and 10, we have the record of Eleazar, the son of Dodo of Ahoy, who was with David when they defied the Philistines, and he fought against the Philistines and struck them down until his hand was cramped, and his hand, very vivid image, his hand was glued to his sword with the blood of the Philistines. And you have the record of the exploits of David's mighty men through the balance of chapter 23. And we come into chapter 24, you have David incited to conduct a census to count all of the men of the fighting men of Israel. Well, it's a huge number, about 1.3 million, but it was wrong. You go to 1 Chronicles chapter 21, the parallel account, and there the writer tells us that it was Satan who motivated David to actually do this. The Lord was angry. You look here, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. Doesn't say that God was angry with David and caused this. He was angry with Israel. They've just experienced 2 rebellions, 2 civil wars against the king that he had given them. And David in this is enticed, or his ego is stroked, you might say, by Satan. And it's interesting to notice Joab tries to talk him out of it. Now, Joab has his moments of good counsel, and this is one of them. He tries to talk David out of it, and David prevails over Joab and the captains. It takes nearly a year to count everybody. You have about 1.3 million, but even that's not accurate because the Benjaminites and the Levites are not counted. But there's sin here. The Lord is angry with his people for their unfaithfulness to his anointed. Satan seizes the opportunity to tempt David to do something stupid, which he does. And now you get down here to chapter 24 and verse 10, and God says, all right, David, punishment's coming. Take your pick. Which is your choice? Well, 7 years of famine, 3 months of fleeing before their enemies. Now they've just been through that with their own people. Or 3 days of plague, sword of the Lord, as it's called. And David says, you pick, Lord, because you're merciful and people are not. So they have 3 days of plague, 3 days of pestilence, and 70,000 Israelites die. Here, when the angel of the Lord comes to Jerusalem and is set to attack Jerusalem, set to execute judgment where David's house is, now God stops him. And instructions are given through Gad the prophet. You go to where the angel stopped at the threshing floor of Araunah, build an altar, offer sacrifice. And the closing statements of 2 Samuel are of David's being unwilling to do what Saul was very willing to do, which is offer something that costs nothing. David recognizes the fundamental character of sacrifice. That is, it has to cost or it's not a sacrifice. And so he pays full price for Araunah's property and his animals in order to fulfill the commandment of the Lord. That brings us to the end of 2 Samuel, and that's a little bit longish for this first half of the class. But let's comments, questions, or observations. If not, we'll take about a 10-minute break and then do a fast review of 1 Samuel, and that'll bring us to the end of the course. Questions or thoughts? We'll pick up at 8:10. All right. Rapid review for the whole background of the whole thing. Go back to 1 Samuel, and if you still have the file of the midterm, go over that. That'll make a good brush up for this. After class, I will send you the final as an attachment. It'll be Word or PDF. Take your pick. And you've got a week to get it back to me. Going back to 1 Samuel, you need to know Samuel. Remember, we talked about 3 individuals, Samuel, Saul, and David. You need to know Samuel, his background. The autobiography of Samuel is chapters 1, 2, and 3 of 1 Samuel. His father Elkanah, his mother Hannah. How did Samuel come into the picture? How did he come about? What's unique about his origin and his upbringing? Well, the fact that his father was evidently a Levite and had 2 wives gives us a little bit of an indication of just how corrupted the time of the judges was. You may recall that we talked about the background of that and how it was that Hannah was barren, and so it appears that perhaps Peninnah was a second wife, a younger wife. Tradition suggests that, because Hannah had borne no children. They go up to Shiloh year after year for the feast, and Eli, the high priest, observes Hannah praying, her lips moving but no sound, assumes that she's drunk. Their interview results in him blessing her, promising that her request of the Lord for a child whom she had promised to return to the Lord if he would give her one, that request will be fulfilled. And so she does bear a child, Samuel. What does his name mean? Well, asked of the Lord. He is the Lord's response to my request. When he's weaned, anywhere from probably 3 to 5 or 6 years old, she brings him to Eli, makes good her promise, offers sacrifice, and he lives then, grows to adulthood in the house of Eli, the high priest. He learns his duties there. He also sees, perhaps up close and personal, the corruption of Eli's own sons, and is the bearer of God's judgment against the house of Eli. And remember that God's assessment of Eli's failure to discipline his sons is, you have preferred your sons above me. That's the accusation that the man of God brings against Eli. You have elevated your sons above God in failing to discipline them. Now, Samuel, when God speaks to him, begins to serve as a prophet and comes to be recognized throughout all of Israel, ultimately. Before Eli dies, though, we have conflict once again with the Israelites, and it's here in the battle at Aphek that the Israelites act like the Philistines, and with the help of Hophni and Phinehas, Eli's sons, take the Ark of the Covenant out to the battlefield as if it were some sort of a lucky talisman. And the Philistines overwhelm the Israelites, fighting like men with nothing to lose, and capture the Ark of the Covenant. They take it and put it in the house of their God. Who's their God? Well, that's Dagon, the fish god with the body of a man and the head of a fish. The Philistines were a coastal people, a seafaring people along the coast of the Mediterranean. It's understandable that they would attribute their prosperity to fish, to a fish god. But they put the ark in the temple, and of course then Dagon bows down to the ark. And Dagon has to be stood up again. And the next night Dagon falls down and breaks. Dagon has to be repaired. God doesn't have to be repaired. And finally, they move it from here to here to here, Ashdod to Ekron to Gath. Same results everywhere. The people get sick. They have tumors and they have a plague of rats, evidently. And so they return the Ark of the Covenant finally. The princes of the Philistines, we got to get rid of this thing. This is some bad juju for us. Put it on a cart, hitch some milk cows to it, see where it goes. If it goes to Israelite territory, their God did this to us. If it stays amongst us, it's just coincidence. Well, it goes straight up into Israelite territory. In the course of battles with the Philistines and other conflicts, Samuel erects a stone, a memorial stone, for the people of Israel to remember, and gives it a name. What's the name? As Samuel takes over from Eli and his sons, Eli's sons die in that battle at Aphek. Eli, receiving word, falls over. He's an old man, he's blind, he's heavy, breaks his neck and dies. And Samuel becomes the new judge and priest, high priest in Israel. Every year, Samuel travels a circuit among several towns in Israel, judging, making himself accessible, including his hometown. Where all did he go? You have 4 town names to know. Samuel, for all of his goodness, learned some bad lessons from Eli. His own sons turn out to be unrighteous men. Now, it's not said of them that they abused the women like Eli's sons did, but they perverted justice. They turned aside justice. They were They were not righteous men. In what ways were they unrighteous? That brings you to 1 Samuel chapter 8. 1 Samuel chapter 8 stands out because of the request, which really is more of a demand, that is put to Samuel there by the elders of Israel. All the elders of Israel. Had there been some consultation? Apparently. All the elders of Israel gathered together, came to Samuel at Ramah, and said, "You're old, and your sons don't follow your ways. Appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. You're getting old, you're going to die." That's not very nice. We need a king in place of a judge. Well, whom did Samuel then anoint at God's instruction? That's Saul. But in doing so, Samuel points out the error of the people. If the key phrase or the key statement in Judges is there was no king in Israel and each man did that which was right in his own eyes, and it is, Samuel pointing out the foundational error in their demand for a king really looks back to that period of the Judges and puts it in its proper context. And he gives a sign to confirm that what he says about their demand for a king is not just foolish, but it's sinful. Saul becomes king, though, and doesn't go very far before he begins to make some very foolish, egotistical, self-centered choices and decisions. At Gilgal, he commits his first big public sin that causes a break with Samuel. You need to know what that was. And then, in the matter of the Amalekites, Saul did not obey the Lord at all. But there are two things that stand out in his disobedience, two aspects of his disobedience that stand out. And he makes excuses rather than owning his disobedience. And it's at that point that Samuel pronounces punishment, judgment against the king for disobeying the Lord's commands. God eventually speaks to Samuel with a question. How long are you going to mourn over Saul? Which tells us a good bit about the relationship between Samuel and Saul. Samuel evidently was close to Saul, thought highly of him, had high hopes for him, must have been bitterly disappointed by the messages that he had to bring to Saul after Saul's big public mistakes. Go anoint a new king. Well, where was he supposed to go? Why was he afraid to go there? Who would he encounter there? And what potential mistake might he have made had he gone and just done what he thought was the right thing? As the Israelites come into conflict with the Philistines again, we encounter the greatest of the Philistine warriors. Who is he? And what stands out about him? What's unique about him? He challenges Israel to single combat. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. How often and how long? David goes into battle. not as a soldier, not as a warrior, but as a shepherd, and not with sword and armor, but with his own tools. And that leads to him being elevated in the kingdom, but it also leads to Saul's suspicion of him. David is close to Saul's family during this time. His best friend is one of Saul's sons. His wife, his first wife, is one of Saul's daughters. But daddy-in-law considers him an enemy. Why? How many times did Saul try to kill David? And how many opportunities did David have to kill Saul? And why didn't he kill Saul? During the time that David's on the run, he marries again, at least twice. Who were his wives, and how did he come by them? And where did he go to get away from Saul? Where did he settle, at least temporarily, to escape being hunted by Saul? In Saul's frustration at being unable to touch David, unable to capture him or kill him, he goes and seeks for Samuel. Samuel has died, but Saul is able to communicate with him one more time. How did that come to pass? And where does King Saul's final conflict take place? We know that Saul died in battle. We know that some of his sons died with him. Who were they? Which ones? And how did Saul die? Where was David in all of this? And where was he when he learned of Saul's death? Who told him? And how did he respond? We've gone through 2 Samuel. We've touched some of the things about 1 Samuel. And like I said, if you take the midterm that you've got and just go over it, that'll make a good study for the final, for this part of the final. 130 questions, short answer, most of them just a word or two, a sentence, a couple of sentences maybe. 130 questions, open notes, open Bible, which means no reason not to make a perfect score. Due next week. Just email it back to me. Questions or thoughts or comments? Then you get out of class early tonight. Thank you for taking the class. Look forward to seeing you in Kings and Chronicles next spring. And until then, God bless you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.